Some ghosts refuse to stay buried. They linger in the shadows of frontier towns in the whispers that follow a woman who pours whiskey with hands that never tremble. Hands that once could split a playing card at 100 paces. 7 years is a long time to hide who you really are. 7 years of building something worth protecting, of learning to sleep without a gun beneath your pillow. 7 years of almost believing you've outrun your past. Then they arrive with their dark coats billowing like raven wings with offers that aren't offers and threats barely concealed behind polite smiles. They don't realize that this quiet mountain town harbors more than silver in its veins. They don't know that legends can rise from their own ashes. But they're about to learn that some fires don't consume. Some fires forge. And the woman they've come to destroy has already walked through flames that would have broken lesser souls. The morning sun climbed over the jagged peaks of Silver Canyon, painting the weathered buildings of Redemption Falls in hues of golden amber. Margaret Maggie Callahan stood behind the polished oak bar of the Wayfarer Saloon, polishing glasses with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years perfecting small, mundane tasks. 7 years in this dusty mining town had taught Maggie patience. 7 years of pouring whiskey for miners and ranchers, of listening to their stories while sharing none of her own. 7 years of being the enigmatic widow who ran the most respectable establishment in town. Her storm gray eyes narrowed as she watched three riders approach through the saloon's front window. Their dark coats billowed like raven wings against the morning light. "Trouble," she whispered to herself, her hand instinctively moving beneath the bar where her father's custom Colt Peacemaker rested in a hidden holster. Before the strangers dismounted, Jeremiah Foster, the aging blacksmith who'd become something of a surrogate father to Maggie, pushed through the saloon doors, his weathered face tight with concern. "Maggie," he said, keeping his voice low, "those men outside, they're Harlans." Maggie's expression remained neutral, but her grip tightened on the glass in her hand. Victor Harlan. A name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in years. "You're certain?" she asked. Jeremiah nodded. "That tall one in front is Nathan Cross, Harlan's enforcer. Word is they've been taking over small towns across the territory. Sweetwater fell last month." Maggie set the glass down with deliberate care. "Get Dr. Hayes and Sheriff Collins. Tell them to come in through the back. And Jeremiah." She caught his eye. "Tell them to come armed." After Jeremiah slipped out the back door, Maggie reached beneath the bar, her fingers brushing against the smooth walnut grip of the Peacemaker. She didn't draw it. Not yet. The bat-wing doors swung open with an unnecessary force that silenced the morning chatter of her patrons. Three men entered, their eyes scanning the room with the practiced efficiency of predators. The leader, Cross, moved toward the bar with measured steps, spurs jingling with each movement. He was tall and lean, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the jagged scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Nathan Cross at your service." Maggie acknowledged him with the barest nod. "Welcome to the Wayfarer. What can I offer you this morning?" Cross smiled, revealing a gold tooth that caught the morning light. "Information primarily. I represent a businessman with interest in this fine establishment." "The Wayfarer isn't for sale," Maggie replied flatly. Cross's smile didn't falter. "Everything has a price, Mrs. Callahan," she supplied. "Margaret Callahan, Mrs. Callahan." He rolled the name on his tongue as if tasting it. "My employer, Mr. Victor Harlan, is a visionary. He sees potential in Redemption Falls that the current leadership has failed to recognize." At the mention of Harlan's name, several patrons quietly settled their tabs and departed. Maggie gave them brief, reassuring nods as they left. "Mr. Harlan is offering to purchase your establishment for a generous sum." Cross continued, placing a folded document on the bar. "Twice its market value, in fact." Maggie didn't touch the paper. "As I said, the Wayfarer isn't for sale, not at any price." "Oh." The smile finally slipped from Cross's face. "Mrs. Callahan, perhaps you misunderstand the nature of Mr. Harlan's offer. It's not one that people typically decline." "I understand perfectly," Maggie replied, her voice cooling by several degrees. "And my answer remains the same." The saloon's back door opened and Sheriff Collins entered, followed by the town doctor, William Hayes. Both men wore sidearms, though neither had drawn. Everything all right, Maggie? Collins asked, his hand resting casually near his holster. Just fine, Sheriff, she replied without taking her eyes off Cross. These gentlemen were just leaving. Cross glanced between Maggie and the sheriff, reassessing the situation. After a moment, he placed his hat back on with deliberate slowness. Very well, Mrs. Callahan. We won't take up more of your valuable time today. He tipped his hat slightly. But I should mention that Mr. Harlan is a persistent man. He doesn't take rejection well. Neither do I, Mr. Cross, Maggie replied evenly. After the three men departed, Sheriff Collins approached the bar. At 45, Michael Collins was still a formidable figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with the quiet confidence of a man who'd spent his life upholding the law in increasingly lawless territories. Harlan's men, he said, not a question. They're moving faster than we anticipated. You knew they were coming, Maggie asked sharply. Collins sighed. Rumors telegraphed from Sweetwater last week. Didn't want to worry folks without confirmation. He glanced toward the window where Cross and his men were mounting their horses. Guess we have it now, Sheriff. Dr. Hayes interjected. If Harlan's operation follows the same pattern as Sweetwater, we have maybe 3 days before more of his men arrive. Collins nodded grimly. I'll send a telegraph to the federal marshal in Denver, though who knows if help will arrive in time. After the men left, Maggie moved to her office above the saloon. She locked the door behind her and crossed to a walnut chest tucked in the corner. Her hands trembled slightly as she inserted a small key into the lock. Inside lay the remnants of a life she'd left behind 7 years ago. A custom Winchester rifle with silver inlay along the barrel, a pair of ivory-handled Colt revolvers, a leather belt with specialized holsters designed for quick draws, and beneath these, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, a folded poster. One night only, see the legendary Phoenix perform impossible shots that defy belief. The most celebrated markswoman in the West. Maggie stared at the image of her younger self, posed with a rifle, her hair styled elaborately beneath a wide-brimmed hat adorned with feathers she'd buried Phoenix when she'd come to Redemption Falls. Buried her alongside the memories of blood and gun smoke of targets acquired and eliminated, of the clandestine work for the Pinkerton agency that had made her both famous and infamous. After Thomas, her husband, had died, she'd chosen a different path. A quiet life. A life where she never had to draw a gun in anger again. But now Victor Harlan had found her. And unless she was willing to run again to abandon the home and community she'd built, Margaret Callahan would have to remember how to be Phoenix once more. At dusk, Maggie sat on the roof of the Wayfarer, the Winchester rifle across her lap. From this vantage point, she had a clear view of Redemption Falls Main Street, the hotel where Cross and his men had taken rooms, and all potential approaches to her establishment. The town was unnaturally quiet. Word had spread about Harlan's men, and most citizens had retreated to their homes, doors locked and windows shuttered. The familiar weight of the rifle in her hands brought back memories, some she'd cherished, others she'd spent years trying to forget. She'd been 19 when she first discovered her uncanny talent for marksmanship, shooting bottles off fence posts at her father's ranch in Colorado. By 21, she was performing in traveling shows, amazing crowds with impossible shots. At 23, the Pinkerton agency had recruited her for more covert work, tracking fugitives, protecting witnesses, and occasionally eliminating threats that conventional law enforcement couldn't handle. It was during one such assignment that she'd met Thomas Callahan, a saloon owner whose establishment had been targeted by an outlaw gang. She'd been sent to protect him. Instead, they'd fallen in love. They'd had 3 beautiful years together before tuberculosis took him. Thought I might find you up here. Maggie didn't startle at Dr. Hayes' voice. She'd heard his footsteps on the access ladder. William Hayes settled beside her, offering a cup of coffee, which she accepted gratefully. At 50, the doctor had the kind eyes and steady hands of a man who'd spent his life healing others. The silver in his dark hair and beard had come early earned through years of frontier medicine. Mind telling me what you're planning? He asked, nodding toward the rifle. Not planning anything, Maggie replied. Just assessing. Hayes gave her a sidelong glance. Margaret, I've known you for 7 years, and in all that time, I've never seen you touch a firearm. Now suddenly you're on a rooftop with a custom Winchester that looks like it's seen considerable use. He sipped his coffee. Doesn't take a doctor's training to diagnose something. Significant has changed. Hekunan. Maggie remained silent, her eyes fixed on the hotel down the street. Collins told me about your conversation with Cross. Hayes continued, said, you handled it like someone accustomed to dangerous men. Michael talks too much. Maggie murmured, he cares about you. Hayes said simply, as do I, which is why I'm asking, what aren't you telling us? Maggie sighed, the weight of secrets carried too long, making her shoulders sag. Victor Harlan isn't just another ambitious criminal, William. He's methodical, calculating. He doesn't just take over towns, he transforms them. First legitimate businesses, then saloons, then worse. She met Hayes's gaze directly. I've seen his work before. During your time with the Pinkertons, Hayes asked quietly. Maggie's eyes widened slightly. How did you? Small towns have big ears, Margaret. I treated Jeremiah for a bullet wound 3 years ago. In his delirium, he said some interesting things about you. Hayes smiled gently. Don't worry, your secret's safe with me. Maggie absorbed this, then nodded toward the hotel. 3 of Harlan's men arrived today. Within 48 hours, there will be more. They'll secure key positions throughout town, apply pressure to business owners, identify potential resistance. Her voice took on a clinical detachment. Once they've established control, Harlan himself will arrive to oversee the final consolidation. You know his methods well, Hayes observed. I was sent to stop him once. Maggie said quietly, 5 years ago, a mining town in Montana, Copper Falls. Her grip tightened on the rifle. I failed. Hayes watched her face carefully. What happened? Harlan was always one step ahead. When I tried to arrest him, he was ready, had hostages, innocent people. The memory made her voice catch. I hesitated. He didn't. And now he's here. Hayes said, now he's here. Maggie confirmed. But this time I won't hesitate. And the doctor was silent for a long moment. What do you need from me? Prepare your clinic for casualties, Maggie said, and keep what you know about me between us. For now. Hayes nodded and rose to leave. At the roof access, he paused. Margaret, whatever you're planning, remember you're not alone anymore. After Hayes departed, Maggie remained on the roof watching as lights flickered on in windows across Redemption Falls. This town had given her sanctuary when she needed it most. Now she would defend it even if it meant becoming Phoenix once more. To rush no more. The following morning, Maggie was serving breakfast to the early patrons when the saloon doors swung open. Sheriff Collins entered, his expression grim. We need to talk, he said quietly, nodding toward her office. Upstairs, Collins paced the small office, while Maggie waited patiently behind her desk. Marshal Stone won't be coming, he finally said. Telegraph came this morning. He's dealing with a situation in Silverdale. Can't spare any deputies. So we're on our own, Maggie stated. Not entirely. Judge Harrison in Silver City is sending legal documents, property deeds, banking records, evidence of Harlan's illegal activities. Might give us leverage. Documents won't stop bullets. Michael, no, but they might stall Harlan until federal authorities can respond. Collins stopped pacing and faced her directly. Maggie, there's something else. Cross and his men, they've been asking questions about you. Specific questions. Maggie's expression remained neutral, but her pulse quickened. What kind of questions? About your past, where you came from, whether anyone knew you before you arrived in Redemption Falls. Collins hesitated. They're offering good money for information about a female sharpshooter who performed in Wild West shows. Has anyone talked? Maggie asked. Not yet, but money has a way of loosening tongues. Maggie rose and moved to the window, looking down at the main street where people went about their morning business, unaware of the danger gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. Michael, there's something you should know, she began, but was interrupted by shouting from below. They rushed downstairs to find Jeremiah Foster stumbling through the saloon doors, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. Jeremiah, Maggie helped him to a chair while Collins poured a whiskey. Martha's Cafe. The blacksmith gasped, downing the offered drink. Cross and his men, they're tearing the place apart. Without hesitation, Maggie moved to the glass case mounted on the wall behind the bar. It held what everyone assumed was a standard shotgun for dealing with rowdy customers. Instead, she removed a streamlined Henry rifle with custom sights. Maggie Collins said, his voice tinged with warning. "Let me handle this. It's my job." Adi. "Then do your job, Sheriff," she replied, checking the rifle's action with practiced efficiency. "But I won't let Martha face those men alone." Something in her tone and the way she handled the weapon made Collins step back, seeing her in a new light. "You're not just a saloon owner, are you?" "No," Maggie admitted, "I'm not. And it's time Harlan's men learned that." Martha Chen's cafe occupied a simple clapboard building, 2 doors down from the Wayfair. By the time Maggie and Collins approached, a small crowd had gathered outside their faces, showing the mixture of fear and anger, typical of citizens confronted with violence. They felt powerless to stop. Through the cafe's windows, Maggie could see overturned tables and broken dishes. Cross stood in the center of the destruction, one hand resting casually on his holstered revolver. His 2 companions methodically smashed plates and glasses, while Martha, a petite Chinese woman who had earned the town's respect through years of hard work and exceptional cooking, was cornered against the wall. Her face pale with fear, Collins entered firsthand on his holster. "That's enough," he called out. "This stops now, Cross." Cross turned slowly, his scarred face splitting into a mocking smile. "Sheriff Collins, just having a conversation with Miss Chen about the dangers of operating a business without proper protection." "The only danger in this town came in with you," Collins replied. "Now I'm asking you once to leave this establishment." Cross exchanged glances with his men, who had positioned themselves strategically around the cafe. The tension in the room thickened like smoke. "And if I decline your polite invitation?" Cross asked, his hand drifting closer to his revolver. "Then I'll have to insist." Collins set his own hand hovering near his holster. Maggie assessed the situation with the rapid calculation that had once been second nature. Cross was fast, his posture, and the way his weight shifted to the balls of his feet marked him as an experienced gunman. His companions were equally dangerous, positioned to crossfire from different angles. For a moment it seemed violence was inevitable. Then Maggie stepped forward. The Henry rifle held, not quite pointed at the floor, but not quite aimed at Cross either, a professional's ready position. "Mr. Cross," she said, her voice carrying an authority that made every head turn, "I believe you've made your point. Now I suggest you leave Miss Chen's establishment before this situation deteriorates further." Cross's eyes narrowed as he took in Maggie's stance, the way she held the rifle. The absolute stillness that had come over her. The stillness of a predator prepared to strike. "Well now," he said slowly, "seems the widow has teeth after all." Maggie remained motionless, her gray eyes cold as January frost. "Your business in Redemption Falls is concluded. Mr. Cross, I suggest you and your associates depart by sundown." Cross laughed, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Bold words from a woman alone." "She ain't alone," came Jeremiah's gravelly voice from the doorway. The blacksmith had returned, carrying what was probably an ancient but serviceable shotgun in his gnarled hands. Dr. Hayes appeared beside him, along with several other townspeople. Their initial fear giving way to a simmering anger, Cross assessed the shifting situation with the practiced eye of a tactician. He nodded to his companions. "We'll take our leave, Mrs. Callahan," he said after a moment, "but don't misunderstand, this conversation isn't over, it's merely postponed." As the 3 men moved toward the door, Cross paused beside Maggie. In a voice pitched for her ears alone, he murmured, "You're not what you appear to be, are you? I find myself very curious about what else you might be hiding." Maggie didn't respond, didn't change her position or expression. Only after the 3 men had departed and mounted their horses did she lower the rifle. Martha Chen sagged against the wall in relief. The cafe was in shambles, broken dishes, overturned tables, food splattered across the floor and walls. "Thank you, Margaret," Martha said, her voice shaking. "When that tall one put his hand on his gun, I thought, Maggie moved to her friend's side, helping her to a chair. It's going to be all right, Martha. She looked around at the other townsfolk who had entered the cafe. But I need all of you to listen carefully. Her voice took on a tone of quiet authority that few of them had heard from her before. Harlan's men aren't leaving. What happened here today was just the beginning, a demonstration to frighten you to make you believe resistance is futile. What can we do? Someone asked from the crowd. Sheriff Collins is just one man, and there's no help coming from the marshal's office. Maggie straightened, and something in her posture caused the murmuring crowd to fall silent. For just a moment, they glimpsed someone other than the reserved widow who had run the Wayfarer for the past 7 years. Someone with steel in her spine and ice in her veins. You protect your families, she said simply. Prepare for trouble. As for Cross and his men, a cold smile touched her lips. Leave them to me. As the crowd dispersed and people began helping Martha clean up the cafe, Sheriff Collins pulled Maggie aside. We need to talk, he said, his voice low. The real conversation we were about to have before all this. Maggie nodded, knowing the time for secrets had passed. Tonight my office bring Dr. Hayes and Judge Monroe. There are things you all need to know. When night fell, Maggie's office above the Wayfarer held an unlikely war council. Sheriff Collins sat beside Dr. Hayes, both men watching Maggie with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Judge Monroe, a sharp-minded woman in her 50s, who had earned her position through sheer tenacity in a profession dominated by men, stood near the window, occasionally glancing down at the darkened street. Jeremiah Foster completed the group, his weathered hands cradling a cup of coffee that Maggie suspected he wished contained something stronger. Thank you for coming. Maggie began standing behind her desk. What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room. She took a deep breath and opened the walnut chest, removing the items one by one. The custom Winchester, the ivory-handled Colts, the leather belt with specialized holsters. Finally, she unfolded the poster and placed it on the desk where all could see. Before I was Margaret Callahan, she said quietly, I was known by another name in certain circles. Sheriff Collins leaned forward, studying the poster. Phoenix, he read aloud. The most celebrated markswoman in the West? He looked up at Maggie, his eyes wide. Sweet Jesus, you're Phoenix. I was, she corrected. For 8 years, Judge Monroe crossed her arms. I saw you perform once. In Denver, 1875. You shot playing cards from the air while riding backward on a galloping horse. Part of the act, Maggie acknowledged, but the exhibitions were just a cover. My real work was with the Pinkerton Agency tracking, fugitives protecting witnesses occasionally. She hesitated, eliminating threats that conventional law enforcement couldn't handle. You were an assassin. Collins said, his voice carefully neutral. I was a government operative. Maggie corrected, meeting his gaze steadily. Sometimes that involved lethal force. Dr. Hayes cleared his throat. I'm guessing Victor Harlan was one of those threats. Maggie nodded. 5 years ago, I was sent to arrest him in Copper Falls, Montana. The operation went wrong. People died. Her voice caught, including my husband, Thomas. A heavy silence filled the room as the others absorbed this revelation. So Harlan's appearance in Redemption Falls isn't coincidence. Judge Monroe stated, he's found you. Yes, Maggie confirmed. And he won't stop until he gets what he wants. Which is what exactly? Collins asked. Revenge, primarily, but also control of Redemption Falls. The town sits at a strategic crossroads for his operation, linking his territories in Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. Jeremiah Foster spoke for the first time, his voice rough with emotion. Why tell us this now, Maggie? You kept your secrets for 7 years. Maggie's expression softened as she looked at the man who'd become like a father to her. Because we don't have the luxury of secrets anymore. Jeremiah Harlan's men are already in town, and more will arrive soon. If we're going to defend Redemption Falls, you need to know who you're really fighting alongside. And who exactly is that? Collins asked. Someone who knows Harlan's methods. Maggie replied, someone who can anticipate his moves, exploit his weaknesses. She straightened her shoulders. Someone who never misses. Sheriff Collins ran a hand through his hair, processing everything he'd heard. So what's your plan? Because I'm guessing you have one. I do. Maggie confirmed. She unrolled a map of Redemption Falls and the surrounding area, weighing down the corners with small objects from her desk. First, we need to gather intelligence. How many men Harlan has, where they're positioned, what their timetable is? And how do we do that? Judge Monroe asked. I'll handle the reconnaissance. Maggie said meanwhile Dr. Hayes needs to prepare for casualties quietly, without alerting Harlan's men that we're organizing. She turned to Judge Monroe. Eleanor, I need you to secure those legal documents coming from Silver City. They may not stop bullets, but they'll legitimize our actions in the eyes of territorial authorities. And me? Collins asked. You maintain order, Michael? Keep doing your job as if nothing has changed. We need Harlan's men to believe they're facing a typical small-town sheriff, not a coordinated resistance. Collins nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with his assigned role. What about the town's people? Jeremiah asked. Harlan's men could take hostages, use them as leverage. Those who can leave should do so quietly. Maggie replied, a few at a time, so as not to alert Harlan's watchers. Those who stay need to be prepared to defend themselves and follow instructions precisely. She looked at each person in turn, her expression grave. I won't lie to you, this won't be clean. People could get hurt despite our best efforts. Judge Monroe straightened her shoulders. After what happened to Sweetwater when Harlan took over, I believe most folks here would rather fight than surrender. Maggie nodded, a grim smile touching her lips. Then we prepare for war. As the meeting concluded and her allies departed, leaving at intervals to avoid drawing attention, Maggie returned to her weapons, completing the maintenance with the methodical precision that had once been as natural as breathing. Her mind, however, was working on problems beyond the mechanical. She hadn't told them everything, couldn't tell them everything. Not about the nightmares that still plagued her, of Thomas bleeding out in her arms, while Harlan's men burned Copper Falls to the ground. Not about the mission that had gone so terribly wrong because of her own arrogance, her belief that she could bring a man like Victor Harlan to justice without collateral damage, and certainly not about the moment as Thomas drew his final breath when Phoenix had died too, replaced by a widow who vowed never to pick up a gun again. But now Phoenix was rising from the ashes once more, and this time she wouldn't fail. The first light of dawn had barely begun to paint the eastern sky when Maggie climbed to the roof of the Wayfarer. In the gray half-light, she moved with a fluid grace that would have surprised her regular patrons. Gone was the careful, measured movement of a respectable saloon proprietor, replaced by the silent prowl of a hunter assessing terrain. From this vantage point, she had an unobstructed view of Redemption Falls Main Street, the hotel where Cross and his men had taken rooms, and the key approaches to her establishment. As she surveyed the sleeping town, her mind calculated ranges, angles, and potential scenarios with the mechanical precision that had once been part of her daily routine. The hotel 183 yards, factoring in the slight elevation. The stable 79 yards with a clear line of sight to the entrance. The sheriff's office 112 yards, partially obscured by the barbershop's awning. Her practiced eye noted defensible positions, potential cover sight lines that could be exploited or defended against Redemption Falls, had been her home for 7 years, but she'd never before viewed it as a tactical environment. Now the familiar streets transformed in her vision to a complex web of ranges, angles, and positions, a battlefield waiting to happen. A slight sound from the access ladder alerted her to someone's approach. Without turning, she knew it was Dr. Hayes. The steady, deliberate footsteps were unmistakable. "Coffee," he said, handing her a steaming cup before settling his substantial frame beside her. "Jeremiah's watching the back entrance. Said to tell you 4 more riders came in during the night. Took rooms at the hotel." Maggie nodded, sipping the strong black coffee. "Reinforcements as expected. That makes 7 of Harlan's men in town now. With more to come, I'd wager." "Yes," Maggie agreed. "But not the main force yet. These are scouts establishing presence and gathering intelligence before Harlan himself arrives." Hayes studied her profile in the growing light. The woman beside him seemed subtly different from the employer he'd known for years. Her posture, her alertness, the way her eyes continuously scanned their surroundings. Judge Monroe received a telegram from Silver City. he said, passing her a folded yellow paper. The documents arrived safely with her clerk, evidence of Harlan's operations across the territory, property records, banking transactions, witness testimonies. Maggie scanned the telegram quickly. Good, that gives us legal leverage at least. She refolded the paper and tucked it into her pocket. But Harlan won't be deterred by the threat of prosecution. He's evaded justice for years through bribes, intimidation, and eliminating witnesses. Then why bother with the legal approach at all? Hayes asked, because when this is over, we need the territorial authorities on our side not questioning our actions. Maggie's expression hardened. And because not everyone in Harlan's organization deserves a bullet, some are just men following orders doing what they think is necessary to survive. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. You have a remarkable capacity for mercy considering your background. It's not mercy, Maggie replied, her voice taking on an edge. It's justice. There's a difference. Before Hayes could respond, movement near the hotel caught her attention. Nathan Cross emerged with two men she hadn't seen before, all three mounting horses and heading toward the eastern edge of town, expanding their reconnaissance. She murmured more to herself than to Hayes, identifying key positions, potential resistance. Shouldn't we stop them? Hayes asked. Not yet. Maggie said, let them think they have the initiative. Meanwhile, we gather our own intelligence. She turned to face the doctor directly. William, I need you to pass a message to Sheriff Collins. Tell him to meet me at the old silver mine at sundown. Come alone and make sure he isn't followed. Hayes nodded and rose to leave, but paused. Margaret, there's something else you should know. One of Cross's men was asking about your Winchester, that custom rifle with the silver inlay. Seemed particularly interested in where you got it. Maggie's expression remained neutral, but her mind raced. The Winchester was unique, custom-made for Phoenix by a gunsmith in St. Louis. If Harlan's men recognized it, they were closer to confirming her identity than she'd realized. Thank you for telling me, she said simply. After Hayes departed, Maggie remained on the roof watching as Redemption Falls slowly came to life. Shops opened, people moved along the boardwalks, stagecoaches arrived and departed the normal rhythm of a frontier town, seemingly undisturbed by the dangerous currents swirling beneath the surface. But Maggie saw what others missed: the subtle positioning of Harlan's men throughout the town, the way they observed key buildings and individuals, the quiet conversations with certain citizens who might be susceptible to bribes or threats. They were systematically mapping Redemption Falls' vulnerabilities, preparing for the moment when they would exert control. Standard Harlan methodology: gather intelligence, identify targets, isolate potential resistance, then strike decisively once the groundwork was laid, which meant time was running out. If Phoenix was going to rise from the ashes, it had to be soon. The abandoned silver mine lay 2 miles outside Redemption Falls, its weathered timbers and rusted equipment standing like the skeleton of a prehistoric beast against the fading light of sunset. Maggie arrived early, approaching with caution, her Winchester rifle at the ready. The mine had been Redemption Falls' original reason for existence, producing silver for nearly a decade before the vein played out. Now it served as a stark reminder of how quickly fortunes could change in the West. Maggie positioned herself inside the mine entrance, where she could observe anyone approaching while remaining largely hidden. She didn't have to wait long before the sound of a horse's hooves announced Sheriff Collins' arrival. He dismounted cautiously, his hand resting near his holster as he surveyed the area. Maggie stepped out of the shadows and Collins visibly relaxed. Wasn't sure if you'd come, she said, lowering her rifle. Almost didn't, Collins admitted. Half the town's whispering about you, Maggie. Some saying you're a government agent, others claiming you're an outlaw with a price on your head. He shook his head, hard to know what to believe. And what do you believe, Michael? Collins studied her for a long moment. I believe you're a woman with secrets, dangerous ones, but I also believe you care about Redemption Falls. He sighed, which is why I'm here. Maggie nodded and led him deeper into the mine, where a small lantern illuminated a rough wooden table covered with maps and documents. These tunnels run beneath half the valley, she explained, indicating various points on the map, including directly under Redemption Falls itself. Collins examined the maps with newfound interest. You're suggesting we use the tunnels? As part of a larger strategy, yes. Maggie traced a path with her finger. This main shaft emerges behind the livery stable. This one beneath the old church, and this one, she tapped a location marked with an X, comes up less than 50 yards from the hotel where Harlan's men are staying. How do you know all this? Collins asked. These tunnels aren't on any official maps. I've spent 7 years exploring them, Maggie said. Old habit, always know your territory. Collins shook his head in wonder. All this time I thought you were just a widow running a saloon? I was, Maggie replied, her voice softening. That part wasn't a lie. Michael Thomas was my husband. He did die of tuberculosis, and running the Wayfair has been my life for 7 years. She met his gaze steadily. But before that, I was someone else. Someone Harlan has very good reason to fear. Collins absorbed this, then nodded toward the documents spread across the table. So what's the plan? Maggie outlined her strategy using the tunnels to move people and supplies undetected, establishing hidden defensive positions throughout town, preparing escape routes for civilians if fighting broke out, and most importantly, isolating Harlan from his forces when he arrived. A snake is most dangerous with its head attached. She explained, remove Victor Harlan from the equation, and his operation becomes significantly more vulnerable. You're talking about killing him, Collins stated flatly. Maggie met his gaze steadily. I'm talking about neutralizing a threat by the most efficient means available. But if there's a way to accomplish that without bloodshed, I'm amenable to alternatives. Collins was silent for a long moment, wrestling with the implications of what she was proposing. Finally, he asked, What do you need from me? Intelligence, Maggie replied. You're the sheriff. You can move freely around town without arousing suspicion. I need to know how many of Harlan's men are arriving, where they're positioned, who they're talking to. Collins nodded. I can do that. Anything else? Yes, Maggie said, her voice growing serious. When the time comes, I need you to trust me, even if what I'm asking seems impossible or wrong. Before Collins could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the mine entrance. Maggie extinguished the lantern, immediately plunging them into darkness. Were you followed? She whispered, drawing one of her Colt revolvers. No, Collins replied, his own gun now in hand. I made sure of it. They moved deeper into the mine, taking cover behind an abandoned ore cart as 5 riders appeared at the entrance. Silhouetted against the setting sun, Nathan Cross dismounted first, followed by the other 4 men. Spread out, he commanded. The sheriff's horse is still here. They can't have gone far. As Harlan's men began to search the mine, Maggie assessed their options with rapid precision. The tunnel behind them led deeper into the mountain, eventually connecting with the main shaft that emerged near the livery stable. But reaching it meant moving through nearly half a mile of dark, unfamiliar passages. We need to split up, she whispered to Collins. I'll draw them off. You take the main tunnel back to town. I'm not leaving you to face 5 armed men alone. Collins protested. This isn't a discussion. Michael, Maggie's voice was steel. Redemption Falls needs its sheriff, and I can handle myself. Before he could argue further, Maggie slipped away, moving deeper into the mine with the silent grace that had once been her trademark. Collins hesitated, then reluctantly headed toward the main tunnel. Maggie navigated the darkness with confidence, her senses heightened by years of training. The sound of pursuit grew louder as Cross and his men realized they'd been detected. She's heading toward the south tunnel. Someone shouted, Cut her off at the junction. Maggie smiled grimly. They thought they knew the mine's layout. They didn't. Just before reaching the junction, she ducked into a narrow side passage, one that didn't appear on any maps. The passage curved steeply upward, emerging in a small cavern near the mine's upper entrance, a secondary shaft used for ventilation that had been abandoned years ago. From this position, she could observe Cross and his men as they converged on the junction, their lanterns casting long shadows against the tunnel walls. Spread out, Cross ordered. Thompson, you and Davis take the south tunnel. Reynolds with me to the east. Jackson, stay here and watch the junction. The men dispersed as directed, leaving one man, Jackson, standing alone at the junction, rifle at the ready. Maggie studied him from her hidden position. Young, nervous, his eyes darting at every sound echoing through the mine. The weak link, silently she circled through the upper tunnels until she was positioned directly above him. Then with practiced precision, she dropped a small stone behind him. Jackson spun, rifle raised. "Who's there?" No response came from the darkness. He took a step toward the sound, then another. "I know you're there," he called, his voice betraying his nervousness. "Come out now and maybe Cross will let you live." Maggie dropped another stone, this time to his left. Jackson whirled again, firing blindly into the darkness. The shot's echo reverberated through the tunnels like thunder. "What the hell was that?" Cross's voice carried from the eastern tunnel. "Wow, thought I heard something," Jackson replied, backing slowly toward the junction. "There's someone here." While his attention was diverted, Maggie descended silently behind him. By the time he sensed her presence and began to turn, her Colt was pressed against the base of his skull. "Drop the rifle," she whispered. Quietly, Jackson complied, the weapon clattering to the stone floor. "Now we're going to have a conversation," Maggie continued, her voice deadly calm, "about Victor Harlan's plans for Redemption Falls." "I don't know anything," Jackson stammered. "I just follow orders." "Then you're of no use to me," Maggie replied, applying slightly more pressure with the Colt. "And I don't leave witnesses." "Wait." Jackson's voice cracked with fear. "Harlan's arriving tomorrow noon stage from Denver Cross, has been preparing for his arrival, securing the hotel, mapping the town, identifying troublemakers. I don't know how many men in total. 15 in town by tomorrow morning. Another 20 with Harlan." Maggie absorbed this information with professional detachment. 35 men, far more than she'd anticipated. "What else?" she pressed. "What's Harlan's plan once he arrives?" "Town meeting at the church," Jackson said quickly. "Harlan will make his offers, purchase businesses, establish new ones. Those who cooperate get to stay, those who don't. Us say we'll have accidents." Maggie finished for him. She'd seen this pattern before in Copper Falls first. The offers, then the threats, then the examples made of those who refused to comply. "One last question," she said. "Why is Harlan really coming to Redemption Falls? This town isn't large enough to justify this kind of attention." Jackson hesitated, then said, "He's looking for someone, a woman, some government agent who nearly got him years ago. Word is she might be hiding in these parts." Maggie's blood ran cold. "This woman, does she have a name?" "Phoenix," Jackson replied. "That's all I know. Harlan's obsessed with finding her. Says he won't rest until she's dead." Maggie's grip on the Colt tightened almost imperceptibly. "Thank you for your cooperation." Before Jackson could respond, Maggie struck him precisely at the base of the skull with the butt of her revolver, rendering him unconscious. She bound his hands and feet with leather straps from her equipment, then dragged him into a side tunnel where he wouldn't be immediately discovered. By the time Cross and the others returned to the junction, she was long gone, moving through the network of tunnels toward Redemption Falls. The information she'd gathered confirmed her worst fears. Harlan wasn't just expanding his territory, he was hunting Phoenix. Her cover was blown, which meant time had run out for careful planning. Harlan would arrive tomorrow, and when he did, he would bring with him enough firepower to overwhelm any conventional resistance. If Redemption Falls was going to survive, Phoenix needed to rise from the ashes tonight. Ikram. Sheriff Collins was waiting at the Wayfarer's back entrance when Maggie returned, his face tight with concern. "I thought you were dead," he said bluntly. "When I heard that shot in the mine, it wasn't meant for me," Maggie assured him, leading the way to her office where Dr. Hayes, Judge Monroe, and Jeremiah Foster already waited. The expressions on their faces told her Collins had shared what happened at the mine. "You shouldn't have split up," Jeremiah said, his voice gruff with emotion. "We nearly sent a search party." "That would have been a mistake," Maggie replied, removing her coat and checking her weapons with mechanical precision. "But your concern is noted." She quickly briefed them on what she learned from Jackson Harlan's imminent arrival, the number of men accompanying him, the planned town meeting that would serve as cover for his takeover. 35 men, Hayes said, shaking his head. "Those are impossible odds, Margaret." "I've faced worse," Maggie replied without looking up from her weapons. "And they have weaknesses. Their operation relies on intimidation and control. But it also requires legitimacy, the appearance of lawful business to mask illegal activities." Judge Monroe leaned forward. "The documents from Silver City, if we could use them to challenge Harlan's legal standing." It won't stop bullets, Collins interrupted, but it might force him to defend on multiple fronts, divide his attention. Exactly, Maggie agreed. But for that strategy to work, we need to buy time, and that means disrupting Harlan's arrival tomorrow. She unrolled a fresh map of Redemption, Falls and the surrounding area, making quick notations with a pencil. The noon stage follows this route through the northern pass. If we could delay it, create a washout or a rock slide, we'd gain valuable hours. I know those mountains, Jeremiah said. There's a section of road near Eagle's Peak where the hillside is unstable. A few well-placed charges could bring down enough rock to block the stage without endangering the passengers. Maggie nodded. Can you handle it? Jeremiah's weathered face broke into a fierce grin. Been blasting rocks since before you were born, girl. Just need the supplies. I'll arrange it, Maggie promised. She turned to Judge Monroe. Eleanor, I need you to prepare legal injunctions against every business Harlan has expressed interest in purchasing. Use the documents from Silver City to establish a pattern of fraud and coercion. Judge Monroe nodded, already making notes. I'll have my clerk work through the night if necessary. And me, Dr. Hayes asked, prepare your clinic for casualties. Maggie said, her voice softening slightly. And keep what you know about me between us. For now, she turned finally to Collins. Michael, when the stage is delayed, Cross will suspect something. He'll likely send men to investigate. That's when you make your move, arrest as many of Harlan's men in town as you can on whatever charges you can manufacture. Disturbing the peace, carrying concealed weapons, outstanding warrants. Collins frowned. That's stretching my authority. Only until the federal marshals arrive, Maggie assured him. The important thing is to reduce Harlan's forces in town before he arrives. With assignments distributed, the group prepared to depart, each with their role to play in the desperate gambit to save Redemption Falls. As they filed out, Collins lingered behind. There's something you're not telling us, he said once they were alone. About Harlan. About why he's really coming to Redemption Falls. Poonin, Maggie was silent for a long moment. He knows I'm here, Michael. He's coming for Phoenix. Collins absorbed this. Then let's give him what he wants. Set a trap. Use you as bait. That's not your decision to make, Maggie replied, her voice cooling. And it's not a strategy I'm willing to consider. Why not? It's the most direct approach. Because the last time I confronted Harlan, directly innocent people died. Her voice caught, including my husband. Collins' expression softened. I'm sorry, Maggie, I didn't know. Few do, she said quietly, and I'd like to keep it that way. After Collins departed, Maggie moved to the window, watching as the last light faded from Redemption Falls. Tomorrow, Victor Harlan would arrive, expecting to find a vulnerable town ripe for conquest. Instead, he would find Phoenix waiting, not as the government agent who had failed to stop him 5 years ago, but as a woman defending her home with every skill and resource at her disposal. A soft knock at her door preceded Jeremiah's entrance. The blacksmith carried a small wooden box, which he placed carefully on her desk. Custom ammunition. He explained, opening the box to reveal rows of gleaming brass cartridges. Made them myself based on the specifications you provided. Silver tips like you asked? Maggie picked up one of the cartridges, examining it with professional appreciation. Perfect as always. Thank you, Jeremiah. The old blacksmith watched her with knowing eyes. Silver tips won't improve accuracy. Maggie, they're heavier than lead, less predictable in flight. The silver isn't for accuracy, she replied, loading the cartridges into her Winchester. It's a message for Harlan. Jeremiah nodded slowly. A calling card from Phoenix. Yes, Maggie confirmed, chambering around with practiced efficiency. It's time Victor Harlan learned that some ghosts don't stay buried. Dawn broke over Redemption Falls, painting the surrounding mountains in hues of gold and crimson. From her position on a rocky outcropping above Eagle's Peak, Maggie watched as the first light touched the winding stagecoach road that connected the town to Denver. She'd been in position since midnight, dressed in dark clothing that blended with the shadows, her Winchester rifle across her lap. The altitude was punishing, nearly 9,000 feet, with thin air that burned the lungs and numbed the extremities despite the summer temperature. But discomfort was an old companion to Phoenix, one she'd learned to acknowledge and dismiss during countless surveillance operations. Movement on the road below caught her attention. Three riders moving at a steady pace, their silhouettes distinct against the lightening sky. Nathan Cross and two of his men conducting an early morning reconnaissance of the stage route before Harlan's arrival. Standard procedure for Harlan's operation: secure all approaches, identify potential ambush points, establish an overwhelming presence that discouraged resistance. Maggie raised her field glasses, studying the men as they paused at a bend in the road, precisely where Jeremiah had placed the charges. The previous night, Cross dismounted, examining the ground with careful attention, then remounted and continued up the pass. She pressed her transmitter twice, a signal to Jeremiah, who waited with the detonator a quarter-mile away. The old blacksmith would know that Cross had inspected the site, but found nothing suspicious. The charges were well concealed, as Maggie had expected from a man with Jeremiah's experience. She checked her timepiece. 8:30. The Denver stage wouldn't reach Eagles Peak until shortly before noon, which meant she had nearly 3 hours to wait. 3 hours to contemplate what awaited in Redemption Falls. By now, Sheriff Collins would be implementing his part of the plan, manufacturing reasons to arrest as many of Harlan's men as possible, reducing the forces awaiting their leader's arrival. Judge Monroe would be filing injunctions against Harlan's planned property acquisitions, creating legal obstacles that would force him to divide his attention, and Dr. Hayes would be preparing for casualties, converting the church basement into a field hospital, with supplies smuggled in through the mine tunnels. All of these actions would help, but Maggie harbored no illusions. When Victor Harlan arrived in Redemption Falls, blood would flow. The only question was whose. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist that clung to the mountainsides. In the growing light, Maggie could see the full expanse of the valley below, with Redemption Falls nestled at its heart. From this distance, the town looked peaceful, almost idyllic, a collection of weathered buildings and dusty streets that had somehow become home. She thought of the people who had welcomed her 7 years ago: Martha Chen, with her bottomless pots of tea and quiet wisdom; Jeremiah Foster, who had taught her blacksmithing as therapy for her grief; Dr. Hayes, who had never once asked about the scars that marked her body; Sheriff Collins, with his unwavering belief in justice, even when the law fell short. These people had given Margaret Callahan a second chance when Phoenix's ashes were still warm. Now it was Phoenix's turn to protect them. A whistle pierced the mountain air, 3 short bursts followed by one long Jeremiah signal. Maggie raised her field glasses, scanning the road below. In the distance, she could see a cloud of dust approaching from the direction of Denver. The stage was early, very early. Maggie pressed her transmitter 3 times, the signal to abort. Something was wrong. Through her field glasses, she watched as the approaching vehicle came into view. Not the Denver stage with its distinctive red and black paint, but a private carriage, sleek and black, drawn by 4 matching thoroughbreds that spoke of wealth and status. Victor Harlan's personal transport. Maggie's mind raced. Harlan never traveled by public stagecoach. The information she'd extracted from Jackson was either deliberately false or a feint to disguise Harlan's actual arrival plans. Either way, their carefully orchestrated ambush at Eagles Peak was now useless. She quickly assessed her options. The carriage would reach Redemption Falls within the hour long before she could return to warn the others. Her only chance was to intercept it here on the mountain pass, where Harlan's guards would be constrained by the narrow road and steep terrain. But that meant facing Harlan directly, the very scenario she'd been planning to avoid. Maggie took a deep breath, steadying herself as she had countless times before a difficult shot. Then she signaled Jeremiah again, 1 long whistle followed by 2 short. Their predetermined code for change of plans: follow my lead. She repositioned herself behind a large boulder that provided both cover and a clear line of sight to the road below. The Winchester felt alive in her hands, an extension of her will as she calibrated for distance, wind speed, and the steep downward angle. As the carriage approached the bend where the charges had been placed, Maggie squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, its report echoing across the mountainside like thunder. The shot was perfectly placed, striking the road directly in front of the lead horses, sending up a spray of dirt and gravel that caused the team to rear in panic. The driver fought to control the frightened animals as the carriage slid perilously close to the edge of the cliff. Maggie fired again, this time severing the lead horse's traces with surgical precision. Freed from the carriage, the panicked animals bolted down the road, leaving the remaining team struggling to control the now unbalanced vehicle. The carriage lurched to a stop, teetering dangerously near the precipice. Four men emerged quickly, three guards with rifles ready surrounding the fourth figure, who Maggie recognized instantly, despite the years that had passed. Victor Harlan stood calmly amidst the chaos, straightening his tailored suit, as if he'd merely stepped out for an afternoon stroll. At 50, he remained an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked dark hair and the patrician features of old money. Only his eyes betrayed his true nature, cold and calculating like a predator, assessing potential prey. "Phoenix," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "I know it's you. That shot severing the traces without harming the horses, that's your signature." Maggie remained silent, adjusting her position slightly to maintain cover, while keeping her rifle trained on Harlan. "5 years is a long time to hold a grudge, my dear," Harlan continued, turning slowly to survey the mountainside. "Though I must admit I'm flattered by the effort you've gone to for our reunion." His guards had spread out, using the carriage for cover while scanning the slopes above. They were professionals, their movements betraying military training, far more dangerous than the common thugs Harlan typically employed for intimidation. "You have two options," Harlan called out. "Come down and face me directly, or watch as I destroy everything and everyone you've come to care about in Redemption Falls." Still, Maggie didn't respond. She could end it now. One clean shot at this distance was well within her capabilities, but killing Harlan wouldn't stop his operation. His men would carry out his final orders, and Redemption Falls would suffer all the same. She needed Harlan alive, at least until she could dismantle his organization and ensure the town's safety. "Very well," Harlan said after a moment of silence. "If you won't come to me, I'll simply have to draw you out." He gestured to one of his guards, who retrieved a small brass tube from inside the carriage. "Do you recognize this, Phoenix? It's the same design you used in Copper Falls. Quite effective for sending messages across long distances." The guard raised the signal flare and fired. A bright red streak sailed into the sky, exploding in a crimson burst visible for miles. "That," Harlan explained calmly, "is the signal for my men in Redemption Falls to implement contingency orders. Even as we speak, they're taking hostages: the blacksmith, the Chinese cafe owner, the doctor, the judge, the sheriff. Anyone you might care about." Maggie's blood ran cold. Contingency orders. She should have anticipated this. Harlan always had multiple layers of planning, always prepared for betrayal or resistance. "You have 1 hour to surrender yourself at the Wayfarer Saloon," Harlan continued. "After that, I start executing hostages, one every 30 minutes until you appear." He smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Oh, and to demonstrate my seriousness," he nodded to one of his guards, who raised a rifle and fired a single shot toward a cluster of rocks to Maggie's right. A cry of pain echoed across the mountainside. Jeremiah. Without hesitation, Maggie broke cover, firing 3 rapid shots that forced Harlan and his men to duck behind the carriage. Then she was moving, scrambling across the rocky terrain toward where Jeremiah had fallen. She found the old blacksmith collapsed behind a boulder, blood streaming from a wound in his shoulder. "Damn fool shot," he gasped as she knelt beside him. "Wasn't even aiming proper." Maggie quickly assessed the injury. The bullet had passed clean through the fleshy part of his shoulder, painful but not immediately life-threatening. "Can you move?" she asked, already tearing strips from her shirt to bind the wound. "Been shot worse, falling off a horse," Jeremiah grumbled, though his pallor suggested otherwise. "What about Harlan? He's issued an ultimatum," Maggie replied, helping Jeremiah to his feet. "I have 1 hour to surrender at the Wayfarer, or he starts executing hostages." "You can't turn yourself in," Jeremiah protested. "That's exactly what he wants." "I don't intend to," Maggie assured him. "But I do need to get back to town before the deadline expires." Supporting Jeremiah's weight, she led him down a narrow game trail that descended steeply toward the valley. It would take them far from the main road where Harlan and his men would be watching, but the difficult terrain would slow their progress considerably. "Can you make it?" she asked as Jeremiah stumbled on the uneven ground. "I'll make it," he growled, determination overriding pain. Just don't expect me to win any foot races. As they made their perilous descent, Maggie's mind worked furiously, recalculating their options. If Harlan's men had indeed taken hostages, the original plan was now impossible. She couldn't risk open confrontation with innocent lives at stake, but perhaps there was another way using Harlan's ultimatum against him. Jeremiah, she said as they paused for the blacksmith to catch his breath. The charges you set at Eagle's Peak, can they be detonated from town? Jeremiah nodded, wincing with the movement. There's a second trigger wire running down to the old mill. Why? Because we're going to need a diversion, Maggie replied, and I think I know just how to create one. Redemption Falls was unnaturally quiet when Maggie and Jeremiah finally reached the outskirts of town. No miners heading to their claims, no merchants calling their wares, no children playing in the dusty streets. Windows were shuttered doors, barred a town holding its breath. They approached cautiously, using the abandoned buildings on the eastern edge as cover. From this position, Maggie could see armed men patrolling in pairs, their military precision confirming her worst fears. Harlan's contingency plan was already in motion. The church, Jeremiah whispered, nodding toward the white steeple that rose above the town center. 2 guards stood at the entrance, rifles held ready. Bet that's where they're holding the hostages. Maggie nodded in agreement. The church was the most logical location, centrally positioned, with a clear sight line to the Wayfarer's solid construction that would be difficult to breach without detection. Can you make it to the mill on your own? She asked, checking the time. 38 minutes until Harlan's deadline expired. Don't worry about me, Jeremiah assured her, his face pale but determined. Just tell me when to trigger those charges. Wait for my signal, Maggie instructed. A single shot from the church steeple, then count to 30 and detonate. After Jeremiah departed, Maggie made her way toward the heart of Redemption Falls, moving from shadow to shadow, with the silent efficiency that had once been Phoenix's trademark. The town she'd called home for 7 years had transformed into enemy territory, with Harlan's men controlling every approach to the center, but they didn't control what lay beneath their feet. Reaching the abandoned smithy on Cedar Street, Maggie slipped inside and located the trapdoor hidden beneath years of accumulated dust and debris. It opened to reveal a narrow shaft that descended into darkness, one of the many mine tunnels that honeycomb the ground beneath Redemption Falls. Maggie lowered herself into the shaft, closing the trapdoor behind her. The darkness was absolute, but her hands remembered the way finding the iron rungs embedded in the rock with practiced ease. 30 feet down, the shaft opened into a horizontal tunnel barely wide enough for a single person to navigate. Maggie moved forward by touch alone, counting her steps as she had during countless explorations of this subterranean maze. 317 steps brought her to a junction where 3 tunnels converged. She took the leftmost passage, which gradually inclined upward. 200 more steps led to another shaft, this one ascending toward the surface. Maggie climbed carefully, mindful of the ancient wooden supports that groaned beneath her weight. At the top, a rusted metal plate blocked her progress. She pressed against it, gently feeling it give slightly. She was beneath the church, voices filtered through the metal plate, muffled but discernible. She recognized Sheriff Collins' deep baritone, Dr. Hayes's precise diction, Judge Monroe's crisp authority. All alive, though Collins sounded injured, his words slurred as if speaking through pain. Maggie checked the time again. 22 minutes until Harlan's deadline. She continued listening, counting voices, trying to determine how many hostages were being held and how many guards were watching them. She identified Martha Chen, the telegraph operator Samuel Johnson, and at least 4 other townspeople whose voices she recognized but couldn't immediately name. 2 other voices belonged to Harlan's men, one positioned near the altar, the other apparently pacing near the entrance. Professional guards, judging by their clipped, efficient communications, Maggie weighed her options. She could emerge directly into the church through this access point, but the noise would alert the guards immediately. She needed a distraction, something to draw their attention elsewhere, while she freed the hostages. She thought of Jeremiah waiting at the mill, ready to detonate the charges at Eagle's Peak. The explosion would be visible and audible from town, but would it be enough to distract Harlan's men? Possibly, but she couldn't rely on it alone. Carefully, she shifted the metal plate just enough to create a narrow opening. Through it, she could see slivers of the church interior, the polished wooden pews, the stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns across the floor, and most importantly, the hostages gathered near the altar, guarded by two of Harlan's men. Just as she'd surmised, Sheriff Collins was indeed injured. A bruised and swollen face suggested he hadn't surrendered without a fight. Dr. Hayes was attending to him, despite his own bound hands, while Judge Monroe sat rigidly beside them, her expression one of controlled fury. Maggie shifted her position slightly, trying to get a better view of the guards. The movement caused the ancient support beam beside her to creak audibly. The sound, though slight, was enough to alert the nearest guard. "Did you hear that?" he asked his companion. "Probably just the old building settling." The other replied dismissively, "This whole town's falling apart." "I'm going to check it out," the first guard insisted, moving toward the source of the sound, directly toward Maggie's position. She backed away from the opening, calculating rapidly. If the guard discovered the access point, her entire plan would be compromised. But if she retreated deeper into the tunnel, she risked losing precious minutes she didn't have. Decision made, Maggie readied herself. As the guard's footsteps approached, she drew her knife, a sleek, well-balanced blade designed for silent work at close quarters. The metal plate shifted as the guard examined it. A beam of light from his lantern pierced the darkness of the shaft, followed by the guard's curious face as he peered into the opening. Maggie struck with the precision that had made Phoenix legendary, one swift, silent movement that ended with her hand clamped over the guard's mouth as she pulled him headfirst into the shaft. The knife found its mark with surgical accuracy, and the guard went limp without ever making a sound. Maggie lowered the body, carefully ensuring it wouldn't be visible from above. Then she checked the time again. 14 minutes. "Jenkins!" The second guard called, his voice tinged with impatience. "What are you doing over there?" Maggie reached into her boot and removed a small device, one of Phoenix's specialized tools, a compact sound projector designed to throw voices across distances. She positioned it carefully, then whispered into it. "Nothing, just a rat, big one though." The projected voice emerged near where the first guard had been investigating, sounding remarkably like the dead man. "Well, leave the wildlife alone and get back here," the second guard commanded. "Harlan's due any minute." Maggie waited until the second guard's attention was directed elsewhere before lifting the metal plate fully and emerging silently into the church. She positioned herself behind the pews, using their high backs for cover, as she moved steadily toward the hostages. Judge Monroe saw her first, her eyes widening momentarily before her face resumed its neutral expression. The judge subtly nudged Dr. Hayes, who glanced up briefly, then returned his attention to Collins with remarkable composure. 6 hostages Maggie counted, one guard remaining positioned near the altar, with a clear view of both the entrance and the captives. She would have only one chance to neutralize him without endangering the hostages. 8 minutes until Harlan's deadline. Maggie moved to a position directly behind the guards, sliding between pews with the fluid grace that had once been second nature. When she was within striking distance, she palmed a small object from her pocket, a weighted sap designed to render targets unconscious without permanent damage. Judge Monroe chose that moment to create a distraction, rising suddenly to her feet, despite her bound hands. "This is an outrage," she declared in her most authoritative courtroom voice. "Holding officers of the court hostage is a federal offense punishable by—" "Sit down, Your Honor," the guard snapped, turning his full attention to the judge. "Or I'll give you a first-hand demonstration of what punishable really means." It was all the opening Maggie needed. She emerged from cover and struck in one continuous motion, the sap connecting precisely at the base of the guard's skull. He collapsed without a sound, unconscious, before he hit the floor. "Margaret, Iro!" Dr. Hayes exclaimed, his professional composure finally cracking. "Thank God, save the gratitude," Maggie replied, already cutting through their bonds with her knife. "We have less than 7 minutes before Harlan expects me to surrender at the Wayfarer." As the hostages rubbed circulation back into their wrists, Sheriff Collins struggled to his feet, his face contorted with pain. "Maggie Harlan's men, they've taken over the whole town, at least 15 of them." "I know," she said quickly, checking his injuries. A broken rib, possibly two, judging by the way he held himself. But they're expecting me to come alone to the Wayfarer. They won't be prepared for an organized resistance. What's the plan? Judge Monroe asked the authority, returning to her voice now that she was free. First, we need to secure the church, Maggie said, retrieving the fallen guard's weapon and checking it efficiently. Then create a diversion that will draw Harlan's attention away from the Wayfarer, long enough for me to position myself. A diversion? Martha Chen asked, her gentle face hardened with uncharacteristic resolve. What kind of diversion? Maggie smiled grimly. The explosive kind. Working quickly, she outlined her strategy. Dr. Hayes would remain at the church with those two injured to fight, while Sheriff Collins, Judge Monroe, and the others would make their way through the mine tunnels to strategic positions throughout town. When Maggie's signal came, a shot fired from the church steeple. Jeremiah would detonate the charges at Eagle's Peak, creating the impression of an attack from outside Redemption Falls. In the confusion, Maggie explained, Harlan's men will divide their forces, creating openings we can exploit. I'll use that opportunity to position myself at the Wayfarer. And then what? Collins asked, his lawman's instincts clearly troubled by the improvised nature of the plan. And then, Maggie replied, checking her Colts one final time, Phoenix has a long overdue conversation with Victor Harlan. With the plan established, Maggie led the way to the metal plate, now fully removed, to reveal the mineshaft below. One by one, the hostages descended into the darkness, each carrying weapons retrieved from the unconscious guards. Once they were safely below, Maggie replaced the metal plate and moved toward the church's bell tower. The narrow spiral staircase creaked beneath her weight as she ascended, but the sound was lost in the eerie silence that had fallen over Redemption Falls. From the tower's upper platform, she had a commanding view of the town center. Harlan's men were positioned strategically, two at each street intersection, others patrolling in pairs, all maintaining clear sight lines to the Wayfarer. And there, dismounting in front of the saloon, was Victor Harlan himself. He moved with the confident stride of a man accustomed to power, flanked by the same guards who had accompanied him at Eagle's Peak. Maggie checked the time 1 minute until the deadline. She raised her Winchester, using the scope to study Harlan more carefully as he paused outside the Wayfarer, surveying the town he intended to conquer. His expression betrayed no concern. No doubt Retry Claude hit the max length for a message and has paused its response. You can write. Continue to keep the chat going. In. Continue edit that his plan was proceeding exactly as intended. Maggie adjusted her position, bracing the rifle against the bell tower's wooden railing. The shot needed to be perfect, not to kill or injure, but to announce her presence, to establish psychological dominance before the physical confrontation to come. As Harlan reached for the Wayfarer's door, Maggie squeezed the trigger. The Winchester's report echoed through Redemption Falls like thunder. The bullet struck precisely where she'd aimed, severing the saloon sign chain and sending the wooden placard crashing to the boardwalk, mere inches from Harlan's feet. Harlan didn't flinch. Instead, he looked up toward the church steeple, a predatory smile spreading across his face. Phoenix. He called out, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. Right on time. But I believe the terms of our arrangement involved your surrender, not more demonstrations of your marksmanship. Maggie didn't respond. She was already moving, descending the spiral staircase with practiced speed as the first explosion rocked Eagle's Peak. Jeremiah had received her signal and executed his part of the plan perfectly. From the church's ground floor, she watched through a window as confusion erupted among Harlan's men. The explosion had been visible from town, a plume of dust and debris rising from the mountainside where the stagecoach road had been. As Maggie had predicted, Harlan immediately dispatched half his forces to investigate, reducing the opposition she would face. Hostages secure, Dr. Hayes reported, appearing at her side. Sheriff Collins and the others are in position. Maggie nodded acknowledgement. When the second explosion comes, create as much noise as possible from inside the church. Make Harlan believe the hostages are fighting back. And you? Hayes asked, concern evident in his voice. I'm going to keep my appointment at the Wayfarer, Maggie replied, checking her Colts one final time. Hayes caught her arm. Margaret Harlan didn't come all this way just to kill you. He wants to hurt you first, make you suffer. I'm counting on it, Maggie said, meeting his gaze steadily. His need for vengeance is his weakness, one I intend to exploit. Before Hayes could respond, a second explosion erupted from Eagle's Peak. Larger than the first, Jeremiah had detonated the remaining charges, simultaneously creating the impression of a coordinated attack. Maggie slipped out the church's side door as gunfire erupted throughout Redemption Falls Sheriff Collins, and the others, creating the illusion of a town rising against its oppressors. From within the church, the sound of breaking glass and overturned furniture added to the chaos, courtesy of Dr. Hayes and those who remained with him. Moving through the shadows of the alleyway behind the general store, Maggie circled toward the Wayfarer. Harlan's remaining men were now divided, some responding to the apparent uprising, others maintaining their positions around the saloon awaiting Harlan's orders. She reached the rear of the Wayfarer undetected and entered through the secret passage she'd built years earlier, a narrow tunnel that connected the saloon's cellar to an abandoned storage shed 50 yards away. The passage emerged behind a false panel in her private office, allowing her to enter the building unseen. From her office window, she could see Harlan standing in the center of the saloon's main room, calmly sipping a glass of her finest whiskey as chaos erupted around him. His confidence was absolute, the certainty of a man who believed he had accounted for every variable, every possible resistance. But he hadn't accounted for Phoenix rising from the ashes, with 7 years of accumulated knowledge about every inch of Redemption Falls. Every building, every alleyway, every hidden passage, all mapped and memorized during years of quiet preparation. For a moment Maggie had hoped would never come. She checked her weapons one final time, then opened the office door and stepped onto the landing that overlooked the saloon floor. "Hello, Victor," she said, her voice carrying over the distant sounds of gunfire and explosions. "It's been a long time." Harlan turned slowly, his predatory smile widening, as he took in the woman before him, not the saloon owner in her practical dress, but Phoenix in her full regalia. The dark clothing designed for silent movement, the specialized belt with its custom holsters, the pair of ivory-handled Colts that had featured in so many dime novel illustrations. "Margaret Callahan," he said, raising his glass in mock salute, "or should I say Phoenix? You know, finding you cost me 5 years and a small fortune. You covered your tracks remarkably well." "Not well enough, apparently," Maggie replied, descending the stairs with measured steps, her hands deliberately kept away from her holstered weapons. "Though I'm curious, how did you finally make the connection?" Harlan's smile never wavered. "The Winchester, that custom rifle with the silver inlay, is rather distinctive. When one of my men mentioned seeing it during their initial reconnaissance of Redemption Falls, well," he spread his hands, "the pieces fell into place." Maggie absorbed this, mentally berating herself for the oversight. The Winchester had been a gift from Thomas, one she couldn't bear to part with despite the risk it represented. "So here we are," Harlan continued, setting down his whiskey glass. "The legendary Phoenix reduced to running a third-rate saloon in a dying mining town. I must say it's rather anticlimactic." "What do you want, Victor?" Maggie asked, though she knew the answer all too well. "Justice," he replied, his voice hardening. 5 years ago, you destroyed everything I had built in Copper Falls. My businesses, my reputation, my political aspirations, all gone because of your meddling. You were running a criminal enterprise that exploited innocent people?" Maggie countered. "Copper Falls is better off without your kind of business." Harlan's expression darkened. "And who made you judge, jury, and executioner? You're not a lawman, Phoenix. You're just a woman with a gun and a government badge that gave you license to destroy lives." "I never claimed to be anything else," Maggie replied evenly. "But we both know this isn't about justice. Victor, it's about revenge." "Perhaps," Harlan conceded. "But it's also about tying up loose ends. You're the only person alive who can connect me to certain unfortunate events in Copper Falls." "The fire," Maggie said, the memory making her voice catch. "The fire that killed 12 people, including my husband." "Collateral damage," Harlan dismissed with a wave of his hand. "Regrettable but necessary to cover our withdrawal from the town." Something cold and deadly shifted behind Maggie's eyes at his casual dismissal of Thomas's death. "You didn't come to Redemption Falls just to find me, did you?" You could have sent assassins for that. You came because this town represents something you can't stand. People living freely, building a community without your kind of protection. Harlan's smile returned colder than before. You always were perceptive, Phoenix, yes. Redemption Falls has strategic value, a crossroads connecting my interests in Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. But I'll admit, destroying something you care about does add a certain satisfaction to the transaction. Outside, the gunfire had intensified, punctuated by shouts and the occasional explosion as the townspeople continued their orchestrated resistance. Harlan seemed unbothered by the chaos, his attention fixed solely on Maggie. Your people are putting up more of a fight than I expected, he observed, but it won't matter in the end. I have men positioned throughout the territory. Even if you somehow prevail today, Redemption Falls will never know peace again. That's where you're wrong, Maggie replied, taking another step forward. Your operation ends here. Victor today. Harlan laughed, the sound devoid of humor. And how exactly do you plan to accomplish that? You're outnumbered, outgunned, and frankly, my dear, you're 7 years removed from your prime. Phoenix is a ghost, a legend that belongs to the past. Some ghosts don't rest, Maggie said quietly, especially those with unfinished business. Something in her tone made Harlan pause, reassessing the woman before him. His hand drifted casually toward his coat, where Maggie knew he carried a derringer, a holdout weapon for emergencies. Let's not resort to theatrics, he said, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. I'm a businessman first and foremost. Perhaps we can negotiate a resolution that satisfies both our interests? I'm listening, Maggie replied, though her posture remained alert, ready. You have skills I could use, Harlan offered. Join my organization. Put Phoenix's talents to work for me instead of against me. In return, I'll spare Redemption Falls the more unpleasant aspects of my attention. And if I refuse, Harlan's expression hardened, then I burn this town to the ground just like Copper Falls, starting with the people you care about, the blacksmith, the doctor, the sheriff. I'll make you watch as everything you've built here turns to ash. I don't know. Maggie was silent for a long moment, her face betraying nothing of her thoughts. Then with deliberate slowness, she removed her gun belt and placed it on a nearby table. No need for threats, Victor, she said quietly. I've seen what you're capable of. I won't risk more innocent lives. Triumph flashed in Harlan's eyes as he watched Phoenix, his nemesis, the woman who had nearly ended his empire 5 years ago, apparently surrender. A wise decision, he said, motioning to the guards positioned near the doors. Though I must admit, I'm almost disappointed. I expected more resistance from the legendary Phoenix. The legend was always exaggerated, Maggie replied, her hands open at her sides as Harlan's men approached to secure her. I'm just a woman trying to protect her home. As the first guard reached for her, Maggie moved with the lightning speed that had made Phoenix famous. A precise strike to the guard's throat left him gasping for air, while she simultaneously relieved him of his pistol. Before the second guard could react, she had the weapon pressed against Harlan's temple. Call off your men, she instructed, her voice deadly calm, or I finish what I should have done 5 years ago. Harlan remained unnaturally still, his eyes calculating despite the gun at his head. You won't shoot me, Phoenix, not in cold blood. It's not your style. People change, Maggie replied, applying slightly more pressure with the gun. 7 years is a long time to think about mistakes. For several heartbeats, the saloon was silent, save for the wounded guard's labored breathing. Then Harlan raised a hand, signaling his remaining men to stand down. A temporary setback, he said, his voice betraying no fear despite his precarious position. Even if you kill me, my organization will continue. The wheels are already in motion. Akim, maybe, Maggie acknowledged, but you won't be around to see it. She gestured toward the door with her free hand. Now we're going to take a little walk to the sheriff's office. Your men are going to throw down their weapons and surrender, or I put a bullet in your head. Your choice. Harlan's laugh was unexpected, a genuine sound of amusement that made Maggie's skin crawl. Oh, Phoenix, he said, shaking his head slightly. You still don't understand who you're dealing with, do you? I never enter a situation without insurance. Before Maggie could respond, the saloon's front doors burst open, Two of Harlan's men entered, dragging a bloodied figure between them. Jeremiah Foster. The old blacksmith had been badly beaten, his face swollen and bloody, but his eyes still burned with defiance as he met Maggie's gaze. "Sorry, Maggie," he rasped. "They caught me at the mill." Something cold settled in Maggie's stomach as she took in Jeremiah's condition. The man who had been like a father to her was barely standing, supported only by Harlan's thugs. "As I was saying," Harlan continued smoothly, "insurance, now Phoenix. I believe it's time to renegotiate our arrangement." Maggie's mind raced, calculating options, trajectories, potential outcomes. She could still kill Harlan. A simple squeeze of the trigger would end the threat he posed. But Jeremiah would die too, cut down by Harlan's men in retaliation. "Let him go," she said finally, her voice tight with controlled fury. "He has nothing to do with this." "On the contrary," Harlan replied, "he has everything to do with it. Your affection for these townspeople, that's your weakness." "Phoenix always has been." He nodded to one of his men who pressed a gun to Jeremiah's head. "Now lower your weapon or watch history repeat itself." The reference to Copper Falls, to Thomas dying because of her actions, struck Maggie like a physical blow. For a moment she was back there smelling the smoke, hearing the screams, feeling Thomas's life slipping away in her arms while Harlan escaped unpunished. She couldn't let it happen again. Wouldn't let it happen again. "All right," she said, slowly lowering the gun from Harlan's head. "You win, Victor. Just don't hurt him." Triumph flashed in Harlan's eyes as he stepped away from her, straightening his suit with practiced nonchalance. "A predictable decision, but the correct one. Family has always been your weakness. Phoenix." The word family triggered something in Maggie, a realization that Harlan knew more about her than she'd assumed. Had he discovered her connection to Jeremiah, the surrogate father-daughter relationship they developed over the years? "What do you want?" she asked, allowing defeat to color her voice. Harlan smiled, the expression of a predator savoring its prey's final moments. "I want you to suffer as I have suffered, to lose everything, as I lost everything in Copper Falls." He gestured expansively. "This town, these people, they're your family now, aren't they? The family you created after I took the first one from you?" The casual admission of responsibility for Thomas's death confirmed what Maggie had always suspected: the fire in Copper Falls hadn't been an accident or collateral damage. It had been deliberate, targeted specifically at her and those she loved. "You're a monster," she whispered, genuine horror in her voice. "No," Harlan corrected. "I'm a businessman. Sentimental attachments are liabilities in our profession, Phoenix. I thought you understood that." He nodded to his men. "Secure her, then bring the old man. I want him to have a front-row seat for what comes next." As Harlan's men moved to restrain her, Maggie caught Jeremiah's eye. The old blacksmith gave her the briefest of nods, a signal they had established years ago during their target practice sessions in the hills outside town. "Trust me, I have a plan." Maggie allowed herself to be bound, offering no resistance as Harlan's men secured her wrists behind her back with rough rope. But even as they led her from the Wayfarer, her mind was racing, recalculating options, searching for the opportunity that would inevitably present itself. Because Phoenix hadn't surrendered. She was simply waiting for the perfect shot. They marched her down Redemption Falls Main Street like a captured outlaw being led to execution. Harlan walked beside her, seemingly oblivious to the sporadic gunfire that still echoed from the outskirts of town, where Sheriff Collins and the others continued their resistance. "Your people are persistent," Harlan observed as another explosion sounded in the distance. "I admire that even as I prepare to end it." Maggie remained silent, her eyes constantly moving, assessing. Harlan's forces had consolidated around the town center, establishing defensive positions at key intersections. At least 10 men, possibly more, in reserve. Professional gunmen, not common thugs. Their positioning and discipline spoke of military backgrounds. Behind them, Jeremiah was half-dragged, half-carried by two of Harlan's men. The old blacksmith's condition had deteriorated, his breathing labored, his movements uncoordinated. He needed medical attention soon, or he might not survive regardless of what happened with Harlan. Their destination became clear as they approached the church. Harlan intended to use the building's elevated position and clear sight lines to oversee the final subjugation of Redemption Falls. A cold smile touched Maggie's lips. Harlan was walking directly into her territory, the church where Dr. Hayes and the other hostages were concealed, where Sheriff Collins would have positioned additional forces during the chaos of the false uprising. "Something amusing you?" Harlan asked, noticing her expression. "Just thinking about how predictable you are, Victor." Maggie replied, "Always seeking the high ground, the position of authority. Your military background shows even after all these years." Harlan's eyes narrowed slightly. "You've done your research. Know your enemy." Maggie quoted, "Isn't that what they taught at West Point?" The reference to his alma mater seemed to please Harlan. "Indeed," he agreed. "Though you seem to have forgotten another key principle: secure your supply lines. Your resistance is isolated Phoenix. No reinforcements, no support from outside Redemption Falls." "Why are you sure about that?" Maggie asked, nodding toward the horizon where a cloud of dust was visible, approaching rapidly from the direction of Silver City. Harlan followed her gaze, his confidence faltering momentarily as he registered the implications. "Federal marshals," he murmured. "That's impossible. The telegraph lines have been cut since yesterday. Judge Monroe is very resourceful," Maggie replied, "and she has connections in Silver City who were expecting regular communications. When those ceased, they would have sent riders to investigate." Harlan's jaw tightened as he reassessed the situation. The approaching riders, whether federal marshals or merely a regular patrol, complicated his timetable. He would need to consolidate his position quickly if he hoped to maintain control of Redemption Falls. "Accelerate the schedule," he instructed one of his lieutenants. "I want full control of the town center before those riders arrive. Anyone who resists is to be shot on sight." The man nodded and departed at a run, leaving Harlan with 4 guards to escort Maggie and Jeremiah to the church. As they approached the building's entrance, Maggie felt a familiar tension building between her shoulder blades, the heightened awareness that had always preceded action during her days as Phoenix. Her senses seemed to sharpen, time slowing as she cataloged details with professional precision. 2 guards at the church doors, positioned to cover both the street and the interior. 3 more visible inside, their attention focused on something Maggie couldn't yet see: the subtle vibration beneath her feet that suggested movement in the mine tunnels below Collins and his people, positioning themselves for the confrontation to come. Most importantly, the barely perceptible nod from Dr. Hayes, visible through the church's stained glass windows. The hostages were armed and ready. They entered the church, Harlan pausing in the doorway to survey the interior with a tactician's eye. The pews had been pushed to the sides, creating an open space in the center, where Hayes and several townspeople appeared to be tending to the wounded from Harlan's initial takeover. "Secure the doctor," Harlan instructed his men. "We may need his services before this is over." As the guards moved to comply, Maggie caught Hayes's eye. The doctor gave the briefest of nods, confirmation that everything was in place. Harlan turned to Maggie, a self-satisfied smile spreading across his face. "You know, Phoenix, I've imagined this moment for 5 years. You helpless, your precious town under my control. A fitting end to our little saga, don't you think? If you believe this is the end, Victor, then you never really understood me at all." Maggie replied, her voice steady despite her bound hands. Harlan laughed. "Bold words from a woman in your position. But I suppose defiance is part of the legend, isn't it?" He gestured around the church. "Look at your town, Phoenix. Look at what your resistance has accomplished. Property destroyed, people injured, lives disrupted, all because you couldn't accept the inevitable." "What's inevitable," Maggie countered, "is that men like you eventually face justice." "Justice?" Harlan's amusement vanished, replaced by cold fury. "You speak to me of justice. You who executed men without trial, who destroyed legitimate businesses based on nothing more than suspicion." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I've built an empire that spans 3 territories. Phoenix, I've brought prosperity to towns that were dying, provided employment to hundreds. What have you ever built except a reputation for destruction?" The accusation struck closer to home than Maggie cared to admit. How many times had she questioned her own actions during her years as a government operative? How many sleepless nights had she spent wondering if the ends truly justified the means? But Redemption Falls had changed that. Here she had built something lasting, not just a saloon but a home, relationships, a community where people looked out for one another without fear or coercion. I built this, she said, simply nodding toward Hayes and the townspeople, who watched their exchange with undisguised hostility toward Harlan, a place where people live freely. Victor, where they don't need your kind of prosperity. Harlan studied her for a long moment, genuine puzzlement crossing his features. You've changed, he observed. The Phoenix I knew would never have settled for something so ordinary. Maybe I found something worth more than legend, Maggie replied. A commotion at the church entrance interrupted their exchange. One of Harlan's men burst in, his expression urgent. Sir, riders approaching from the east, federal marshals, by the look of their badges, at least a dozen, maybe more. Harlan's jaw tightened. Timetables moved up, he snapped. Secure the town center. Anyone who resists is to be eliminated. No exceptions. As the messenger departed, Harlan turned back to Maggie, his expression hardening. It seems our reunion will be briefer than planned, Phoenix. Pity, he drew a small derringer from his coat pocket. But I can at least ensure you won't interfere with my operations again. Victor, Jeremiah's voice cracked through the church, drawing all eyes to where the blacksmith had slumped against a pew. Before you kill her, at least let me say goodbye. Harlan considered the request, amusement flickering across his features. Touching, he commented. The surrogate father's final farewell. He gestured magnanimously. By all means, it will make Phoenix's execution all the more poetic. Guards dragged Jeremiah forward, positioning him before Maggie. The old blacksmith looked terrible, his face pale beneath the bruises, his breathing labored. Maggie, he rasped, I'm sorry. Nothing to be sorry for, Jeremiah. She replied, genuine emotion coloring her voice. No, there is, he insisted. His eyes clouded with pain, nonetheless held a fierce determination. Should have told you years ago about the letter. Maggie's brow furrowed in confusion. What letter? From Thomas. Jeremiah's voice dropped to a whisper, forcing Harlan to lean closer to hear. Before Copper Falls. He knew what might happen. Left instructions. Understanding dawned in Maggie's eyes. There had never been a letter from Thomas. This was Jeremiah creating a distraction, drawing Harlan's attention. Enough sentimentality, Harlan interrupted, gesturing to his men. Take the old man back. It's time to conclude our business. As the guards moved to separate them, Jeremiah suddenly lunged forward, his bound hands somehow free. In the same motion, he thrust something toward Maggie, a small gleaming object that caught the light streaming through the stained glass windows. A key. The key to her handcuffs. Harlan reacted instantly, raising his derringer. But Jeremiah was faster, throwing himself into Harlan and sending both men crashing into a nearby pew. Chaos erupted while all eyes were focused on Harlan and Jeremiah's struggle. Maggie spun away from her guards, her bound hands finding the key. Jeremiah had managed to pass her. 2 quick movements, and the ropes fell away, freeing her wrists. At the same moment, the church floor seemed to explode as the metal plate covering the mine entrance was thrust upward from below. Sheriff Collins emerged, followed by armed townspeople who had been positioned in the tunnels beneath the church. Now Hayes shouted, and the wounded townspeople suddenly produced weapons hidden beneath blankets and bandages. Harlan's men found themselves surrounded, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. Several surrendered, immediately dropping their weapons and raising their hands. Others attempted to fight, only to be quickly subdued by Collins and his deputies. But Harlan himself was engaged in a life-or-death struggle with Jeremiah. The 2 men grappled for control of the derringer, rolling across the floor in a desperate contest of strength and will. Maggie moved toward them, drawing the knife concealed in her boot. But before she could intervene, a shot rang out, deafening in the confined space of the church. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stop. Then Jeremiah slumped back, blood blossoming across his chest. No! Maggie's cry echoed through the church as she rushed to the blacksmith's side. Harlan rose, the smoking derringer clutched in his hand, a triumphant smile spreading across his face, only to freeze as he found himself staring down the barrel of Sheriff Collins' shotgun. "Drop it!" Collins ordered, his voice brooking no argument. Harlan hesitated, his eyes darting around the church, assessing options, calculating odds. Finally, with deliberate slowness, he placed the derringer on a nearby pew. "This changes nothing," he said, straightening his blood-spattered suit. "I have connections in territorial government judges in my pocket, witnesses who will testify to my whereabouts during any alleged crimes." "Not anymore," Judge Monroe replied, stepping forward with a leather portfolio. "These documents detail your entire operation. Victor property records, banking transactions, witness testimonies, all authenticated by the territorial court in Silver City." Harlan's confident demeanor faltered slightly. "Circumstantial evidence at best, my lawyers will." "Your lawyers won't be able to explain this." Monroe interrupted, producing a telegram from the portfolio. "This came from the governor himself this morning. Special authorization for federal marshals to investigate your activities across 3 territories. You're finished, Harlan." As Collins moved to secure Harlan, Maggie knelt beside Jeremiah, cradling the old blacksmith's head in her lap. Dr. Hayes was already working his skilled hands, moving with urgent precision as he attempted to stem the bleeding. "Hang on, Jeremiah," Maggie pleaded, her voice tight with emotion. "Help is here, just hang on." Jeremiah's eyes, clouded with pain, found hers. "Did we get him?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We got him," Maggie confirmed, tears streaming unchecked down her face. "It's over." A ghost of a smile touched the blacksmith's lips. "Worth it then," he murmured. Hayes looked up, his expression grave. "We need to get him to my clinic." Now, as townsfolk fashioned a makeshift stretcher, Maggie held Jeremiah's hand tightly. "Don't you dare die on me, old man," she whispered fiercely. "I've lost too much already. I won't lose you too." Jeremiah's only response was a weak squeeze of her hand, a promise he might not be able to keep. The clock on Dr. Hayes's office wall ticked relentlessly, marking hours that felt like days as Maggie maintained her vigil at Jeremiah's bedside. The blacksmith lay unnaturally still, his weathered face gray beneath his beard, his breathing shallow and labored, despite Hayes's best efforts. The bullet punctured his lung. Hayes had explained after the surgery, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I've done what I can, but at his age the trauma may be too much for his system to handle." That had been 16 hours ago. 16 hours of watching, waiting, praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. 16 hours of remembering every moment with the man who had become her surrogate father, teaching her blacksmithing, sharing quiet meals, sitting beside her on nights when the nightmares of Copper Falls became too much to bear alone. Outside the clinic's windows, Redemption Falls was slowly returning to normal. Federal marshals had arrived shortly after the confrontation at the church. Taking custody of Harlan and his men, Judge Monroe was coordinating with territorial authorities, ensuring that the evidence against Harlan's operation would be properly preserved and presented. Sheriff Collins had stopped by several times, providing updates on the town's recovery, while gently suggesting that Maggie get some rest. She had declined each time, unwilling to leave Jeremiah's side even for a moment. "He'd want you to take care of yourself," Collins had argued during his last visit. "He nearly died protecting me," Maggie had replied, her voice flat with exhaustion. "The least I can do is be here when he wakes up." "If he wakes up," a traitorous voice whispered in the back of her mind. She banished the thought immediately. Jeremiah Foster was the strongest person she knew, a man who had survived cave-ins, claim jumpers, and the harsh Colorado winters. He would survive this, too. He had to. A soft knock at the door preceded Martha Chen's entrance. The cafe owner carried a covered tray, which she placed silently on the bedside table. "You need to eat," Martha said, her gentle voice brooking no argument. "Jeremiah will need your strength when he wakes." Maggie managed a grateful nod, though the thought of food made her stomach turn. "Thank you, Martha." Instead of leaving, Martha pulled up a chair beside her. "I also brought these," she said, placing a stack of letters on the bed. "People have been leaving them at the Wayfarer for you. Messages of gratitude mostly." Maggie glanced at the letters without touching them. They shouldn't be thanking me. I brought this danger to Redemption Falls. If I had never come here, then our town would have fallen to Harlan eventually, Martha interrupted firmly, and we wouldn't have had someone like you to defend it. Someone like me, Maggie echoed hollowly, a killer, a vigilante. A protector, Martha corrected, surprising Maggie with the steel in her voice. I have lived long enough to recognize the difference, Margaret Callahan or Phoenix, whichever name you prefer. The simple acceptance in Martha's words momentarily robbed Maggie of speech. For 7 years, she had hidden her past, convinced that the people of Redemption Falls would reject her if they knew the truth. Yet here was Martha, gentle, steadfast. Martha accepting both parts of her without judgment. I don't know who I am anymore. Maggie admitted the confession torn from somewhere deep inside her. Phoenix was supposed to die in Copper Falls. With Thomas, Margaret Callahan was supposed to be someone new, someone who didn't live by the gun. Martha nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps neither identity is complete without the other. The woman who protects and the woman who builds. Two sides of the same coin. Before Maggie could respond, Jeremiah stirred slightly, a faint groan escaping his lips. She was instantly alert, leaning forward to clasp his hand. Jeremiah, she called softly, can you hear me? The blacksmith's eyelids fluttered, then opened. His gaze wandered for a moment before finding Maggie's face. Recognition dawned slowly. Maggie. He rasped, his voice barely audible. You're okay. I'm fine, she assured him, tears of relief blurring her vision. You're the one who gave us a scare. Jeremiah attempted a smile, wincing with the effort. Harlan, in custody, Maggie replied. Federal marshals took him to Denver yesterday. Judge Monroe says he'll be prosecuted for crimes in 3 territories. He won't see the outside of a prison for the rest of his life. Satisfaction flickered across Jeremiah's features. Good, he murmured. His eyes began to drift closed again, exhaustion claiming him. Worth it, then. Don't you ever do something like that again, Maggie whispered fiercely, squeezing his hand. I can't lose you too. Jeremiah's eyes opened once more, clearer now. Not going anywhere, he promised, too stubborn to die. As the blacksmith drifted back to sleep, Dr. Hayes entered, smiling slightly at the scene before him. His color's better, he observed, checking Jeremiah's pulse. And his breathing steadier. I believe our patient has turned a corner. The relief that flooded through Maggie was so intense it left her lightheaded. He's going to recover. It appears so, Hayes confirmed, though it will be a long road. Weeks of bed rest followed by months of limited activity while his lung heals. He won't like that, Maggie said, a genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in days. No, he won't, Hayes agreed, which is why he'll need someone to ensure he follows doctor's orders. He fixed Maggie with a meaningful look. Someone stubborn enough to match him? I'll stay as long as he needs me, Maggie promised. Hayes's expression softened. That's not what I meant, Margaret. The question isn't whether you'll stay for Jeremiah, it's whether you'll stay for yourself. The physician's insight struck uncomfortably close to home. Since the confrontation with Harlan, Maggie had been avoiding the question that hung over everything. What would happen now that her dual identity had been revealed to the people of Redemption Falls? Would they accept her knowing the truth about her past? Or would they see her as Harlan had a destroyer rather than a builder, a woman whose very presence brought danger to those around her? And even if they accepted her, could she accept herself? Could Phoenix and Margaret Callahan truly coexist? Or would one identity inevitably consume the other? I don't know, she admitted finally. I need time to think. Hayes nodded, understanding. Take all the time you need. But remember, you have a life here, Margaret, friends who care about you, a community that owes you its freedom. He glanced toward Jeremiah's sleeping form, and a family that needs you. After Hayes and Martha departed, Maggie remained at Jeremiah's bedside, the physician's words echoing in her mind. A family that needs you. For so long she had believed that attachments were liabilities, lessons learned the hard way through Thomas's death and the destruction of Copper Falls. But Redemption Falls had taught her something different. Here, connections weren't weaknesses to be exploited, but strengths to be nurtured. The very network of relationships she had built over 7 years had ultimately defeated Harlan. Not her skills with a gun, but her ability to inspire loyalty, to coordinate resistance, to believe in the fundamental goodness of ordinary people facing extraordinary danger. Perhaps Martha was right. Perhaps neither Phoenix nor Margaret Callahan was complete alone. Perhaps she needed to find a way to integrate both aspects of herself, the protector and the builder, the warrior and the healer. As Jeremiah slept peacefully beside her, Maggie made a decision. Whatever came next, she would face it as her complete self. No more hiding, no more division between who she had been and who she had become. It was time for Phoenix to truly rise from the ashes, not as a legend or a ghost, but as a woman fully alive. So, 2 weeks passed before Dr. Hayes declared Jeremiah stable enough to leave the clinic. The blacksmith's recovery had been remarkable given his age and the severity of his injury, a fact Hayes attributed to sheer stubbornness and a will to live that defies medical explanation. Maggie had arranged for Jeremiah to stay at the Wayfarer during his convalescence, converting the saloon's largest guest room into a comfortable sick room where she could monitor his recovery while still managing the establishment's day-to-day operations. The saloon itself had become something of a gathering place since the confrontation with Harlan. Townspeople stopped by daily, ostensibly to check on Jeremiah, but their curious glances toward Maggie revealed their true interest. Phoenix, the legendary markswoman who had been hiding in plain sight for 7 years. She didn't blame them for their fascination. The story had spread throughout the territory, growing more elaborate with each telling. In some versions, she had single-handedly defeated 30 of Harlan's men in a gun battle that lasted hours. In others, she had performed impossible shots that defied the laws of physics, like the illustrations from those ridiculous dime novels that had once made Phoenix famous. The truth, as always, was both more simple and more complex. Victory had come not through spectacular feats of marksmanship, but through planning, cooperation, and the collective courage of ordinary people defending their home. On this particular evening, the Wayfarer was unusually quiet, just a few regular patrons nursing drinks at corner tables, while Maggie reviewed the accounts behind the bar. The peaceful atmosphere was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Collins, his expression suggesting official business rather than a social call. "Evening, Michael." Maggie greeted him, setting aside her ledger. "What brings you by so late?" Collins removed his hat, running a hand through his graying hair. "Got word from Denver today," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Thought you should hear it directly from me." Maggie tensed slightly. "About Harlan," Collins nodded. "He's dead." For a moment, Maggie couldn't process the words. Dead how? When on a yesterday morning, Collins replied, accepting the whiskey she automatically poured. "Found in his cell at the Federal Detention Center. Hung himself with his belt." Anna. Maggie absorbed the surprise by the complex mixture of emotions the news evoked. Relief that Harlan would never threaten her, or redemption falls again. Anger that he had escaped proper justice through the courts, and beneath it all a hollow emptiness where she had expected to find closure. "Are they certain it was suicide?" she asked. Finally, Collins shrugged. "Official ruling, though there are rumors that someone helped him along." Maggie finished understanding immediately. Someone who didn't want him talking at trial. His organization was extensive. Collins confirmed reached into territorial government, judiciary, possibly even federal offices. A lot of powerful people stood to lose if Harlan testified. Maggie poured herself a measure of whiskey and raised it in a sardonic toast. "To justice, however it comes." "To justice," or Collins echoed, though his expression remained troubled. After a moment, he reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. "There's something else. This came with the official notification addressed to you personally." Maggie accepted the envelope with a frown. Her name was written across the front in an elegant, flowing script she recognized immediately. Harlan's handwriting. It was examined by federal authorities. Collins assured her, nothing dangerous inside, just a letter. With a growing sense of unease, Maggie broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The message was brief, written in the same flowing script as the envelope. "Phoenix. By the time you read this, I will have departed this mortal stage, though perhaps not in the manner our federal friends believe. Loose ends, my dear, They must always be tied. Our contest ends in a draw, it seems. You have your town, I have my freedom, albeit of a more permanent variety than the courts would have allowed. But before I go, a parting gift, the truth you've been seeking for 5 years. The fire in Copper Falls wasn't meant for you or your husband. It was meant for James Mackenzie, whose testimony would have destroyed my operation in Montana territory. That your Thomas died instead was truly an accident, collateral damage in a larger game. Does that comfort you, or does it make his death even more meaningless? I've wondered often how you would react to this knowledge. Now I'll never know. Know this, Phoenix, you were a worthy adversary. In another life, we might have been partners rather than enemies. Think on that in the quiet hours of night when you wonder who you truly are beneath the names you've worn. Farewell, Che. Maggie stared at the letter, reading it twice more to ensure she had understood correctly. The fire that killed Thomas, that had haunted her nightmares for 5 years, had never been intended for them at all. His death wasn't punishment for her actions as a government operative, but simple, terrible chance. Wrong place, wrong time. Bad news. Collins asked, watching her face carefully. No, Maggie replied distantly. Just unexpected. She folded the letter and returned it to the envelope, unwilling to share its contents, even with Collins. This was private, a final exchange between adversaries that no one else could truly understand. There's one more thing, Collins said after a moment. Judge Monroe received a telegram from the federal marshal's office in Denver. They're interested in speaking with you. Maggie's expression hardened. About Harlan, about Phoenix. Collins corrected gently, your work before Copper Falls. Apparently there are still open cases that might benefit from your expertise. They want me to return to service, Maggie stated flatly. Collins nodded. Marshal Stone mentioned consulting, but yes, essentially they're hoping to recruit Phoenix back into government work. And if I decline, they'll respect your decision. Hannah, Collins hesitated. But they're offering a full pardon for any questionable actions taken during your previous service. Legal closure, Maggie. A clean slate, a clean slate. How many times had she longed for exactly that during her first years in Redemption Falls? The chance to truly put Phoenix to rest, to be Margaret Callahan, without looking over her shoulder, without fearing that the past would eventually catch up to her. But now with Harlan dead and her dual identity revealed to the town, did she still need that official absolution? Or had she found something more valuable in Redemption Falls, acceptance of her complete self, both Phoenix and Margaret Callahan? Tell Marshal Stone I'll consider his offer, she said finally. After Jeremiah's recovered, Collins studied her for a long moment. You're not planning to leave Redemption Falls, are you? The question caught Maggie off guard. Why would you think that, Mom? Because I know you, Maggie. You've spent 7 years hiding who you really are, convinced that if people knew the truth, they'd reject you. Collins gestured around the saloon. Now everyone knows, and you're waiting for the other boot to drop. Waiting for the townspeople to turn against Phoenix, the killer in their midst. His insight was uncomfortably accurate. Despite everything that had happened, the successful defense of the town, the gratitude of its citizens, even Martha's explicit acceptance of both her identities, part of Maggie's still expected rejection, still believed deep down that Phoenix and community were incompatible. They haven't seen the worst of what I've done, she said quietly. What I'm capable of. Haven't they? Collins countered. They saw you plan an organized resistance against overwhelming odds. They saw you put yourself at risk to protect others. They saw you choose justice over vengeance with Harlan. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. They saw Phoenix Maggie, the real Phoenix, not the legend or the ghost, and they accepted her. Before Maggie could respond, the saloon's door opened to admit Dr. Hayes, his expression uncharacteristically hesitant. Margaret, he said, approaching the bar. Forgive the intrusion, but there's something you should see. Zoe. Hayes led them outside onto the Wayfarer's front porch. The night had deepened while they talked, stars burning bright in the clear Colorado sky. But it wasn't the stars that demanded attention. It was the sight that greeted them in Redemption Falls Main Street. People, dozens of them, standing silently in the moonlight, each holding a lantern that cast a warm golden glow across their faces. Men, women, children. It seemed the entire town had gathered outside the Wayfarer. "What is this?" Maggie asked, confused. "It's for you," Hayes replied simply. "Word came about Harlan's death this afternoon. People wanted to show their support to let you know." He trailed off as Martha Chen stepped forward from the crowd, her small figure dignified in the lantern light. "Margaret," she called, her voice carrying clearly in the night air. "We know you've been worried about your place here since everything happened with Harlan. About whether you still belong in Redemption Falls now that we know who you were before." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd as Martha continued. "We wanted you to see us, all of us. The people whose lives you saved. The town you protected." She raised her lantern higher. "You belong here, Margaret Callahan or Phoenix. Whichever name you choose, this is your home, and we are your people." One by one, others stepped forward, adding their voices to Martha's. The blacksmith's apprentice, who had helped Jeremiah set the explosives at Eagles Peak. The telegraph operator, who had maintained communication with Silver City despite Harlan's men cutting the main lines. The school teacher who had hidden children in the mine tunnels during the conflict. Each had a story about Maggie's impact on their lives, not just during the confrontation with Harlan, but throughout her 7 years in Redemption Falls. Small kindnesses, moments of connection, contributions to the community that had nothing to do with Phoenix and everything to do with Margaret Callahan. As the testimonials continued, Maggie felt something shift inside her, a wall crumbling, a wound finally beginning to heal. For so long, she had compartmentalized her life, convinced that Phoenix and Margaret Callahan were separate identities that could never coexist, that the skills and instincts of Phoenix were incompatible with the community and connection that Margaret Callahan craved. But Redemption Falls had proven otherwise. Here was a community that accepted her completely, not just Phoenix the protector or Margaret the saloon owner, but the complex woman who encompassed both. Judge Monroe was the last to step forward, her judicial bearings softened by genuine emotion. "5 years ago in Copper Falls, you tried to bring Victor Harlan to justice alone," she said. "You failed because one woman, no matter how skilled, cannot stand against an empire of corruption without allies, without community." The judge gestured around the gathered townspeople. "But here in Redemption Falls, you succeeded because you weren't alone, because you had built something stronger than Harlan's empire, a community bound by mutual respect and genuine care for one another." She raised her lantern, its light illuminating her determined face. "Whatever you decide about Marshall Stone's offer, know this Redemption Falls is your home for as long as you wish it to be. Phoenix or Margaret Callahan, or both, you belong here." The simple declaration, "you belong here," struck Maggie with unexpected force. How long had she waited to hear those words? To believe them, to feel that sense of belonging that had eluded her since childhood. She looked out at the sea of lanterns, at the faces illuminated in their golden glow. People she had known for 7 years. People who had accepted her secrets and silences. People who now accepted her truth with the same generous spirit. And in that moment, Maggie understood what Martha had been trying to tell her all along. Phoenix hadn't died in Copper Falls. Neither had Margaret Callahan been born in Redemption Falls. They were the same woman, different facets of a whole person who had been seeking integration rather than division, acceptance rather than judgment. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "for reminding me what home really means." As the townspeople dispersed, returning to their homes with calls of good night and promises to visit the Wayfarer, soon Maggie remained on the porch watching until the last lantern disappeared around a corner. "Well," Collins said, breaking the silence, "I think that answers the question of whether you're welcome in Redemption Falls." Maggie smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. "I guess it does." "And Marshall Stone's offer?" Hayes asked. "Will you return to government service?" "No," Maggie replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "My place is here, but that doesn't mean Phoenix is dead." She glanced back toward the Wayfarer, where Jeremiah was recovering in his upstairs room. "It just means she's found a better purpose." 3 months later, Maggie stood on the porch of the Wayfarer, watching as autumn painted the mountains surrounding Redemption Falls in shades of gold and crimson. The air carried the crisp promise of winter, though the sun still provided welcome warmth during daylight hours. The town had fully recovered from Harlan's brief occupation. Damaged buildings had been repaired, businesses reopened, and the rhythm of daily life had resumed its familiar pattern. But beneath the surface, subtle changes remained: a new watchfulness among the citizens, a heightened awareness of their vulnerability to outside threats, and perhaps most significantly, a deeper appreciation for the quiet woman who ran the Wayfarer Saloon. The federal marshals had eventually accepted Maggie's decision to decline their offer, though not without multiple attempts to change her mind. In the end, they had indeed provided the promised pardon, a document that now resided in the same walnut chest that had once hidden Phoenix's weapons and identity. The weapons themselves were no longer hidden. The custom Winchester hung openly above the bar, a subtle reminder to troublemakers that the Wayfarer's proprietor was not to be trifled with. The ivory-handled Colts remained in their specialized holsters, ready if needed, though Maggie had found little use for them in peaceful Redemption Falls. The sound of hammering drew her attention to Jeremiah's blacksmith shop across the street. The old man had finally been cleared by Dr. Hayes to return to light work, though Maggie still monitored him closely to ensure he didn't overexert himself. Today he was teaching a group of children how to forge simple iron nails, the first step in blacksmithing education. "He's doing well," Sheriff Collins observed, joining Maggie on the porch. "Hayes says his lung capacity is almost back to normal." "Almost," Maggie emphasized. "Though you wouldn't know it from the way he pushes himself." Collins chuckled. "Stubborn old cuss. Wonder where you got it from." Maggie smiled at the implication of inheritance. In the months since the confrontation with Harlan, her relationship with Jeremiah had deepened from friendship to something more akin to family. They had never discussed it explicitly, but the bond between them was evident to everyone in Redemption Falls. "Any word from Denver?" she asked, changing the subject. Collins nodded. "Judge Monroe received confirmation this morning. The last of Harlan's lieutenants have been sentenced, 20 years hard labor for each of them." He adjusted his hat against the autumn sun. "It's over, Maggie, truly, over Sean." "Good Herm," she said simply, though the word contained volumes of emotion. Relief that justice had finally been served, gratitude that Redemption Falls had been spared, Harlan's brand of prosperity, and beneath it all, a quiet sense of closure for Thomas, for Copper Falls, for the woman she had been before coming to this mountain town. "There's something else," Collins added, his tone shifting slightly. "Marshal Stone sent a personal message for you." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "More recruitment attempts?" "No," Collins assured her. "More of a professional courtesy. They've identified another operation similar to Harlan's starting up in the Dakota Territory. Not as extensive yet, but showing the same patterns." "That's a long way from here," Maggie observed. "It is," Collins agreed. "But Stone thought you should know, given your history with such operations." Maggie considered this, understanding the unspoken question behind the marshal's message. Would Phoenix ride again to confront this new threat? Would the legendary markswoman return to government service, despite her explicit refusal months earlier? "Thank Marshal Stone for the information," she said finally, "but tell him Phoenix is needed here in Redemption Falls." Collins studied her for a moment. "And if this new operation expands, if it eventually threatens Colorado territory, then Phoenix will be ready," Maggie replied, her voice taking on the cool precision that had once been her trademark. "But she won't be alone." The sheriff nodded, satisfied with her answer. As he departed, Maggie turned her attention back to Jeremiah's blacksmith shop, where the old man was demonstrating proper hammer technique to an enthralled group of children. This was the life she had chosen, not the solitary existence of Phoenix moving from mission to mission, without roots or connections, nor the carefully constructed fiction of Margaret Callahan hiding her true self behind a facade of normalcy. Instead, she had found something more valuable: integration, the ability to be both protector and builder, warrior and healer, legend and ordinary woman. Redemption Falls had given her that gift, the chance to be her complete self, accepted and valued for all her complexities and contradictions. In return, she had given the town her loyalty, her skills, her promise to stand against whatever threats might come. As the sun dipped toward the western mountains, painting redemption, Falls in golden light, Maggie stepped back inside the Wayfarer to prepare for the evening crowd. The familiar rituals of polishing glasses, checking inventory, and arranging tables grounded her in the present. In the life she had built here, Phoenix hadn't died. She had simply found a home where her fire could burn without consuming everything around her. A place where ashes became the foundation for new growth, new life, new possibilities. And that Maggie reflected as she lit the lamps that would welcome her patrons was the most unexpected and precious redemption of all.